Welcome to the Autumn Container Gardening course. My name is Kat Haberman. I work at the Morton Arboretum as the horticulture coordinator. One of my major roles at the Arboretum is to order annuals for the spring, summer, and fall season. So I'm quite familiar with the plants that we use for fall and summer. So I'll share some tips with everybody, and hopefully you can make your own fall container as well. So why plant a fall container? Well, you can add color for the fall season and you add interest to an area that you typically cannot plant in. So around a patio or maybe a back door. The photo over here on the right is the back of a building at the Arboretum somewhere on the grounds. And it's just a service entrance for employees, but we thought we would decorate it a little bit with some stuff that we had. And it just really brings a nice festive appearance and brightens up this corner that's usually doesn't have anything besides concrete. So it really kind of plays up the fall ambiance as well. So I think having fall containers can really bring a festive and inviting look to the area that you're decorating, and also just refreshing the existing container. A lot of times with summer containers near the end of the season, they're really on their last leg. They're kind of getting um, discoloration and they're really pop bound. And even if they are looking good, summer plants will not hold on through any frosts. And kales and other fall types of plants can be quite frost tolerant. So just switching things up really extends your season of interest. And lastly, if you have some interesting fall specimen trees or shrubs around your property, like maybe a sugar maple that turns that nice amber color, or even a bald cypress that has the copper color, you can try to accent and those colors with your containers. So you can really just kind of make a cohesive look around your landscape with that. Here's an example I have from my apartment in Chicago from last year, where I have a perennial bed in the background with some late summer perennials blooming and kind of finishing up there, and some annuals that I tucked in, which I'll leave in because they can actually take some frost. But this area, I thought I would amp it up a little bit by planting this container, and I just think that it's a good example of just welcoming fall and just kind of creating something to have this nice interest here. So instead of having a dead patch of grass, I placed an existing container that I had and planted some fall annuals in it. And in this container, we have some peacock kale, a small ruby perfection cabbage, and some orange pansies. And all this stuff can withstand frost as well. So let's talk about types of containers. You may already have a container at your home that you can use, or if you want to switch out a container from summer to fall, you can transition it. But if you need to buy a container, there's a lot of different options. So there's resin and plastic, which is weatherproof, and it can be quite long lasting and inexpensive. And there's lots of different styles and shapes. Terracotta pots, which I think are my favorite type of pot. They have a very warm and earthy kind of look. And as they age, they get like this patina on them from the minerals in your water. Some people like it. It's kind of whitish. Some people don't like it. So depending on what look you're going for, I really like terracotta. It's very warm and earthy. However, it can't stay out in the winter and it could actually crack. Glazed ceramic can be another option if you would like to introduce some color to your surroundings, and you can even use it to kind of play up your plant designs a little bit. But glazed ceramic can be quite shiny and add a pop of color. The containers on the top photo are glazed ceramic pots. So, but they're not weatherproof either, so you would have to bring them in the winter. There's wood containers you can use, like for example, a wooden cedar window box, things like that. Metal, like a galvanized metal tub. And there's just all different kinds of materials. And going for fall, you can kind of play with materials and bring some fun elements. For example, using a wooden window box might kind of look more rustic for that people like to have that rustic look for fall sometimes. My other favorite besides terracotta would be concrete, which is very heavy duty. They are actually heavy to lift, so be aware of that. However, they can stay out all winter. So even if your fall container gets quite frozen near the end, and let's say it's finally done and you want to rip that out, you can even plant winter, no, plant, but you could put evergreen twigs in there and leave them out all year. So that is why I like concrete, because it could just last all year or all year round if that's what you're interested in. So, and there could also be different shapes. So there's not just round, you can do square, tall, circular, window box style, oval. There's tons of different shapes you can play with. So it just depends on your style and where you're putting the container. And potting mix. With potting mix, you would have to refresh your container when you're doing a fall container. Usually by the time, if you're switching out a container from fall to summer, there's going to be too many roots and the soil will be pretty pot bound. So you would have to pretty much dispose of it all and put fresh new potting mix in. That being said, if you have a very, very large container and you take your plants out and there is loose mix near the base of the pot, you don't need to empty that out. You can just top it off. That would be fine. Make sure you buy potting mix and not potting soil. Soil is too heavy for containers. It doesn't drain as well and it could clog, and it's just not the best for plants. Formulated potting mixes like these have a mix of peat moss and perlite and potentially mulch, depending on what brand you get. They're made for container use. You can find them at any local nursery or hardware store even. And with fertilizers, when you add the potting mix into your pot, you can throw a little bit of fertilizer in there and just Osmoco or the Proven Winners one, any kind of granular. You see the spheres on the top right, that's pretty much how they all look. So I would recommend putting that in the container if you have flowers or mums, pansies, flowers like that, because they will need that extra boost to keep blooming and to bloom nicely. There's also liquid food, which I would recommend to do every week or every other week. However, if you don't feel like mixing up a gallon of water with this, the granular would be enough for fall. But like I said, keep in mind if you want really full containers of violas, or if you want your mums to bloom really beautifully, which they will most likely anyway, but it does help them bloom, you can add the fertilizer in. You can even do both. You can add the fertilizer, the granular fertilizer in the beginning, and then do the flower liquid food. And then if you forget to do the liquid food or you're too busy to do it, at least you have the backup of the granular fertilizer. Now let's talk about the fun part, design. So designing a container, there's a few different ways to do it. The most common one that you probably have heard before is thriller, filler, spiller. And, it's a little bit, I don't want to use the word overdone, but how about tried and true? It's a tried and true way to design a container. A lot of people have, touted this thriller, filler, spiller, but it's just a great way for, a basic design concept to just work around. And I'll go over some different kinds of plants you can use for each of these categories. And even when you purchase plants at the store, sometimes they will say on the label, especially if they're a Proven Winners plant, filler or spiller or thriller. However, they may not either. So we'll just go over a few plants that would be good for a fall container. The thriller is usually just an upright plant, tall, something kind of interesting, something that would just bring some height to the container. And you don't even have to use anything flowering or a grass. You could use a tree. You could use a shrub. You can use, even a kale if it's a smaller container. So there's a lot of different options to use here. Pennisetum is a good one too. In this photo, this is in the children's garden with a mix of plants. The middle plant would be the thriller. That's an Acorus ogon. It's actually a perennial, but we use it for containers and beds as an annual. This picture is pretty blurry, but I think you can understand the concept by looking at it. This is also in the children's garden in a pond that is not there anymore, but there's a beautiful Japanese maple, and that is obviously the thriller, and it is just a specimen plant for fall. We tend to do these larger scale plantings at the Arboretum, and this is a huge container, so obviously for the homeowner, it's not typical to have a container of this scale, but it's a good inspiration photo to use a Japanese maple, that kind of texture, some kales, mums. It has a little bit of everything, even some violas. So I just love this container as an example of a thriller because it's unexpected to use a tree, and you can even find a little tree as a specimen for yourself. Here's a window box that I created, and the thrillers would be the grass in the center, which is a pentacetum, and also even the two ornamental peppers on the sides flanking the grass. They're a dark leaf pepper that have an orange and black fruit on them, and I think those are very interesting. They add height to the background, and then there's the filler element with the mums and the kale, but if you notice, there's not really a spiller. So I keep talking about this thriller, filler, spiller. You don't have to exactly follow this formula. That's where you can get a little bit creative. It's just a guideline. So this window box has this beautiful wrought iron frame, and why cover it up? I think it kind of just looks nice on its own. So there's not necessarily a spiller in this pot, to cover it up. So just the thrillers and the fillers are enough in this one, in my opinion, and I think this could be easily recreated. Here's another group of containers in the children's garden, and I want to talk about the grass and the leftmost largest container. That's an ornamental millet. It's called Jade Princess, and it's a really cool plant. It has a fun texture, it's whimsical, and it's a great plant for the children's garden because kids tend to love plants like that. They like to touch them almost a little bit too much because they can get pretty rough with the plants, but it's just a fun, whimsical kind of plant. And it actually also smells like maple syrup, which is really weird. It does get a little bit damaged when it gets a hard frost. However, that's just the leaves. The interesting seed heads still stay up and look sturdy, just like they do in this photo. So I would still recommend this plant, Jade Princess millet. Here's some more examples of thrillers. On the left, there's a smoke bush, which usually you see in the landscape, but we use them in containers at the Arboretum. And this one is called Golden Spirit Smoke Bush. And in the summer, it's a chartreuse green color. But as the cooler weather rolls in, it starts getting this ombre of orange and red. So we leave it in for the fall and change the plants around it. And I just think it's a great specimen plant for fall. The center container is actually a summer container. So I'm not trying to trick anybody or say, use these flowers, but this is a summer container. I would not recommend using the lantana and the colorful flowers. I just like the example of the specimen Swiss chard in the center. That is a bright lights Swiss chard, and this one's kind of like an orangey red Swiss chard because it's a mix of yellows, burgundies, reds, and pinks. So this is just one of the mix. And it filled in beautifully in the summer, and it could transition very well into the fall. All we did for this container was take out the existing annuals around it and add a little bit of potting mix, and we threw in pansies. I'm pretty sure we did pansies. So it was just a very simple, kind of elegant container that could withstand frost, a bit more sustainable because we're not just getting rid of the stuff and composting or throwing away. We're just reusing something, and it's edible. So you could harvest the kale, and actually with the, not kale, sorry, the Swiss chard, and actually with the kale, Swiss chard, it grows very vigorously. So it's best to keep harvesting actually. So you can use it almost like spinach. So it's cool to kind of demonstrate this multi-purpose plant in a container as a specimen or thriller. And lastly, on the right side, that's a perennial grass. It's a panicum. So it looks very airy, and I think it has a classic fall look and almost like a sophisticated look. I really like that, how that container turned out. And that could be even planted in a landscape when it's finished, when you're finished with it in the container. And it's a panicum. And it'll turn more of a bronze yellow. The seed heads will dry out and become a little bit more feathery. So it has a big season of interest. And then this window box, a cedar window box with these annuals and perennials. Those perennials were actually bought from a store that were on clearance at the end of summer, early fall for $1 a piece. I bought three. They're Sedum Autumn Joy, and they were just on a rack at a big box store. And I'm like, well, I might as well pick them up. And I threw them in my window box and planted them with other fall annuals and vines, more chorus, more flowering kale. And even with the unopened flowers, they have that green, it looks good. And as the season went on, the flowers opened up and were a nice deep pink, which you typically see in sedum. And it just brought the container to life. And I really enjoyed it. And it was actually a deal. So you can look out for sedums and things like that at your clearance section occasionally. These kales I really like to use as thrillers. They have an interesting texture and color, so I'll go over a little bit of information over each one. The dinosaur kale on the far left is a blue color. It's also called Tuscan kale or lacinato kale. Sometimes it's called black kale. There's a lot of different names. Dinosaur is a variety, but the Tuscan kale is very crinkly, almost leathery looking, but it is a true blue and it gets nice and tall and it really could fill out a container. So I would plant it in the middle or in the back off, like center in the back, and fill plants around it. It's a very beautiful plant. And when you purchase it in the garden center, it may look about small or medium, but it will definitely grow in the container. If you put fertilizer, it'll help. And the scarlet kale, or sometimes it's called red boar, there's different varieties, but they're usually this color and uh, shape. So this plant is a great fall plant. Purple, looks just beautiful in the fall and very richly colored. It makes a great accent plant or thriller plant. It gets big as well. And blue curled Scotch kale is not quite as blue as the Tuscan kale. It's a more of a greenish blue, but it is definitely one of my favorite plants. I think the crinkly leaf texture just adds a whole nother element of dimension to the container, planted with other flowers or other kinds of kales even. I like these three types of kales a lot for thrillers or just the focal point of pots. That being said, you could even plant these, mid to late summer and just kind of get them started if you're just have a container available like now and this time of year, I mean, and start filling it around with stuff. And these could take quite a bit of frost as well. Here's an example of the scarlet kale used at Chicago Botanic Garden, and they planted it as a thriller or as a specimen type of plant, and they just put a ton of colorful flowers and grasses around them. And you can see how the kale's texture is just very interesting in this, and it kind of stands out. And the color is just magnificent. It's so rich, and it's just a deep purple color, and it never really fades. It doesn't really peter out. It just looks really nice. Filler. Filler plants have more of a mounding type of growth habit, and they're used to fill the height gap between the thriller and the spiller plants. And if your thriller and your spiller are foliage plants, then try to get ooh, that says summer. Try to get a plant that will flower. So not all summer, because we're not talking about summer, but that will flower. So if you have like a leafy Swiss chard, like in this photo, and then you have the ornamental flowering kales, it's nice to actually have a flower. So like the mum is the perfect filler, or even a big patch of pansies would have been nice. Things like that, just kind of play with different textures and play with different colors as well and types of plants. Here's some more examples of fillers. The first photo is a pansy. You will typically see this type of pansy in fall with these colors, flowering kale in the center, and mums. And I do have a tip about mums and a general rule that we have at the Arboretum. So we only use late flowering mums. We really like to extend and go late into the fall season. If we get mums that bloom too early, our displays look pretty shabby near October, or like when we really have autumn festivities going on. So I've taken that and done that at home as well. I won't really buy early mums anymore. I think they're too early. So I pick late mums. You could even do mid to late mums. And I just think that's a great tip to pass along to everybody. More examples of filler. So here we have Ruby Perfection cabbage and Blue Dynasty cabbage. Both of these cabbages can get quite large. You can buy small 4-inch pots of them, but you can also buy 8-inch pots or 12-inch pots of them at certain nurseries. Hinsdale Nursery sells Blue Dynasty cabbage. They probably have other varieties as well, but they're actually edible cabbages that people grow, or even horticulturists or farmers grow for edible use for a crop. However, horticulturists, designers, landscapers, everyone likes to use these for the landscape in the fall as a display plant because they are so pretty. They're very autumnal in their appearance. The color is very vivid. For example, the Ruby Perfection cabbage is a nice bluish purple. And as the season progresses, it does form a cabbage in the center, and that's purple in color. And it's very, very interesting. And the Blue Dynasty cabbage just has this really nice green, soft look. And then as the season progresses, it gets almost like a blush color on some of the leaves. So I really recommend using this. And they fill up a large space in your container. So you could use them as, I know I have them as a filler in this section, but if you buy a big enough plant, it could be the thriller. Dusty Miller is a great fall plant. People usually use it for summer, but it transitions very well into the fall. And if you've had it in your container for summer, you can leave it in for fall, and it'll actually be a decent size then for you, and you can plant around it. However, you can still purchase a brand new Dusty Miller plant in the fall to put in your container. And I'll go over a few of these flowering kales. Peacock white kale is a very nice ornamental kale. And this one is peacock white. It also comes in peacock red, which would be kind of similar in coloring to that Osaka red to the right, but it would have the same texture as the peacock. And it starts off really white in the center and kind of green on the edges. But as the season gets cooler and the day length gets shorter, but it's mostly the weather, affects these plants in a way where it makes them more vivid, and the center of the plant becomes more of a blush or pink color. So these plants, as you watch your container in the beginning, they have this interesting texture, but as the season goes on, they only get enhanced by the weather. Osaka red kale is another type of flowering or ornamental kale, and it's very round and kind of with that layered look, looks very good in containers, and it could look quite formal if you plant it like in a circular pattern on the edge and fill it in with vines and have a specimen or thriller in the center. And there are so many of these kales. I only used 2, but if you go to a nursery or any kind of garden center, you will see a huge variety. So just pick some up and just kind of play with the colors that you're trying to go for. There's so many options. There were too many for me to cover in this presentation. I just thought I would hit 2, one with the texture and one that's just has that nice color. And mustard plants are also a great plant for filler because they just are very vigorous. They can take a little bit of frost. They have a nice color. They're edible, which is very cool, kind of like with what we were talking about with the Swiss chard. But you may see red giant mustard. You may see another type of leaf, like a cut leaf type of mustard that's green color. There's a lot of different kinds, so keep your eye out for those type of plants. And with this red giant mustard, if you do plant it, it can be a little fragile when you put it in your container, and it tends to snap off, which is very discouraging when you're planting. Um, but it's so vigorous that it grows right back and it gets very nice and full. So don't get discouraged by things like that happening. And ornamental peppers are a good filler. I think they are so fun and a unique, interesting way to add color to your container in just an unexpected way. Like peppers, people usually think summer, or even on the last picture on the right, people, those look like regular chili peppers. And technically, these peppers are edible. They're called ornamental because they're bred to be specifically used ornamentally for displays. And they're bred to have this kind of colorful fruit or foliage. However, they're very spicy if you do eat them. Like I said, they're edible, but I wouldn't recommend eating them because they're just so hot. But I think they're very cool. Another thing about peppers, quick, is that when they cannot take a hard frost like kale can because their leaves just shrivel up. However, the peppers do stay on. So if that's a sacrifice you're willing to make to have these shorter season plants, I'd say go for it if you have enough other things in your container to kind of cover up the leaves. But sometimes that can happen, so you can try to run out and cover your stuff if you have a lot of peppers. But I think they're very fun. We can talk about spiller now. So just low growing plants that drape over the edge of a container. So you want to plant these to kind of soften the edge of the container, maybe to add another type of color to your pot or another leaf shape or texture. Here's just some examples of spillers that I like to use. On the far left photo, in that big urn photo, there is Creeping Jenny, which is most likely left over from the summer. This is not my photo. I found this photo online, but it looks like it was there from the summer because if you bought that plant in the fall, it wouldn't be that big already. So they probably had it in summer, left it in. But even if you did buy it in the fall, it would grow not to this level, but it would at least drape over and grow. But creeping Jenny is a great plant for that spiller look. Another plant I'd like to talk about here is this variegated English ivy, which this list should be 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's all ones for some reason. But the variegated English ivy is a great plant that I just love to use in containers because it adds a more sophisticated element to a pot, and it's a little bit different than just using green ivy. A lot of things tend to be green in the fall with the cabbages and the grasses. Yeah, they can be colorful with mums and, the purple kale, but just having a little break of white in there with the variegation adds more depth to the container. And I would recommend using that. It's one of my favorite spillers. My ultimate favorite spiller is sedum. So the sedum sieboldi, if you could find that, or any other kind of ground cover type of sedum, is a great spiller plant. It's very, depending on the color, but I'll talk about sedum sieboldi. This plant fills in very nicely over the edge of the container, and it has this very bluish green soft look, which goes well with almost everything in fall. And then it has the buds, which eventually do open into flowers, which are this beautiful, like burgundy-ish pink color. And I think that's a great contrast with the leaves. And it's way more interesting than just having creeping Jenny or having just a leaf. So I would recommend using this. And eventually you could plant it in your landscape. So it's a perennial if that's the way you want to go about it. Highly recommend sedum sieboldi if you could find it. Lastly, I'll talk about wire vine, which is also called Muhlenbeckia. I think it's a very fun plant. It looks like little green shiny coins on a wire to me. I think that is just so cool and different. And it does fill in pretty nicely on a container. This previous slide has it in the first small pot. That's the wire vine in there. And that is from leftover from summer into the fall. So if you buy it, it may be like in this container size and it would look like that, which I still think looks good. Now we can talk more about what to do with these plant recommendations. I told you about these plants and a few tips, but really, how do you actually design with them? So we'll go over a few design concepts like monoculture design or mixed planting and some color themes and just how to use the perennials. A monoculture container is very straightforward. It's just one type of plant in the container. It's really simple and it's very just, I don't know, not too easy. I just think it's just a very simplistic, but if it's done well, could look very sophisticated and very effortless, but also have very high impact. Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's bad. Sometimes that's a good thing. Using this method can highlight a great piece of pottery that you already own. If you have a certain color of container that you want to just accent, or if you just have some kind of etching or design element on the pot that you don't want to cover up, then I would, this would be a great way to highlight that. Another tip I will have to give you is when you are planting containers with these monoculture containers, but with any container for fall, but especially monoculture, but any container as well, definitely buy plants that will immediately fill your container. With these pansies, there's no way if you just put one in the middle of your pot, it will fill by throughout the season. I would not recommend doing that at all. Even with all the fertilizer you're going to put in there, it is not worth it. It's more worth it to spend the extra money on larger plants if you can, or for more quantity of plants, just so they can fill. You want to start, when you plant the fall container, go for a more finished look when it's completed versus in the summer when you plant it and kind of watch it grow over time. The fall season is a lot shorter, it's a lot cooler, there's less sun, so it's not going to grow as vigorously as it would in the summer. So that is one important tip that I have, is to just immediately plant something that will immediately fill the container. Here's some more examples of the monoculture thing I was talking about. So on the leftmost picture is your classic orange mum. So this is just one probably very large mug that they bought and put in this container, but it works. I don't think it's boring. I think it's very interesting because of the container. So this person used a little bit of color or um, contrast color design, which I will go over a little bit later in detail, but you can see that light blue container, periwinkle color goes so nice with the orange, it just works. It's a bold statement and it's not too simple because the mum is just it stands out. So I really like that container. In the middle, that is a sedge, like a perennial sedge, and I love how it looks in this blue glazed ceramic container. It is so wiry looking and very kind of, I don't know, whimsical and kind of has just an interesting texture. And even if you do this type of monoculture container, it doesn't just have to be by itself on a chair or a stool. You could plant these monoculture containers and arrange them with other containers. So that's another way to kind of design. So having like 3 different pots and just putting the pots by each other in a grouping instead of 3 mixed containers that are mixed in a grouping. And I think that can also look very appealing to the eye just with how simplistic it could be. And lastly, on the right in that concrete container is heuchera, which is a great fall plant. It's a good filler, which I didn't put on the previous screen because I'm going to talk about it here, but this one is a nice plum color. I think it has such an impact in this container. This container is from summer, but it could easily be transitioned into the fall and left in for the fall. But there's so many different colors to play with. There's caramel colored heucheras, there's reds, there's variegated silvery ones, purples, black, chartreuse, but this plum one I just love. And you can add them in mixed containers as well, but even just as a standalone monoculture container, I think it has a lot of impact. We'll talk about color themes now. I kind of touched a little bit on color theme with that previous one with this mum here with the blue and the orange, but I'll dive deeper into it. But first I'll talk about monochromatic color. Monochromatic color is just a similar color palette within the container. So very similar shades, maybe two different colors within the same range, like pink and purple, orange and yellow, but things like that. And they can be pretty simple to do. And I think they could be pretty effective if they're done right. This container is a Dusty Miller with variegated grass, a variegated euphorbia, and a pansy that looks like it's going to bloom white. So it's very monochromatic. And depending on where this could be, it could end up looking really good. And it's kind of different for fall for this container. Here's a picture I found online on Pinterest or through Fine Gardening, and it is just such a beautiful example of a monochromatic container. And this one is shades of purple. So they took the shades of purple with that red giant mustard in there. They put some flowering kales and a heuchera in the center, purplish blue pansies, and I think just the different textures within the purple color palette, it doesn't look boring at all. It doesn't look too complicated either. I think this container is perfect. It's like a window box, but like a tabletop planter. So it's just nice. They even have the wire vine in there and some sedum. So there's a lot of different elements within this monochromatic color theme that just work and look very nice. They even added some accent pumpkins of like whites and grays, which I think is also very nice and a little bit more subtle than using the orange pumpkin. There's so many varieties of pumpkins out there. It's just fun to play with those colors and textures as well. With the colors, there's warm and cool, and obviously just without even looking at this or without even, talking about it, if you ask someone what's a warm color, red or orange, people know warm colors. People know what cool colors are, blues, light greens, purples. So, but I'll talk more in depth about it. Warm colors draw attention to the eye where someone wouldn't usually look. So if you have an area in your landscape that you want to draw attention to, usually like a red plant or an orange plant, even a yellow plant will really just make your eye just shoot over there, and it just draws the attention. However, on the other hand, cool colors tend to blend in with the surroundings. They're known to be very therapeutic, calming, and soothing. Cool colors are very natural in our zone 5 environment, especially in the summer. But when we talk about fall, I think cool color combinations are quite unexpected and very interesting, just because everything is kind of reds, orange, everything's very warm in the landscape with that seasonal color change. So a cool color container, I think, is just a nice surprising element that you could add to your landscape. Here are some examples of photos I found online that are warm, on the warm side, orange. So on the left photo, the terracotta containers are just warm themselves, but planted simply with these orange pansies, I think it has a very inviting, very warm vibe to this front porch stairwell area. And I think it just is very like a fall display. And I think when someone sees that, they're just very enthusiastic about welcoming the fall. It's orange. Same thing on the right with the orange pumpkins. There's a whole window box here planted with the ivies and the little ivy topiaries, but your eye just goes right away to the orange. I think it's a really good example of like how your eye just goes to orange. But I think it's very simple and done very well. This is a great way to do a window box for the fall. It looks like they sprayed their pumpkins, which I have another tip for you is spray your pumpkins if you don't want squirrels. So at the Arboretum, of course, we have tons of squirrels. Oh gosh, we have tons of squirrels. They're always going after our pumpkins. They're eating them all the time. So we spray them with polyurethane, just spray paint that you can find at your hardware store. And it gives them this nice sheen, but it also prevents squirrels from nibbling on them. They might take a tiny little nibble or something out of it, but they are not going to destroy them as much as they usually would without spraying them. So this is the warm color. Here's a cool color theme, which like I was saying is very unexpected for fall. This photo I took in 2018 at the Chicago Botanic Garden, and it is just stunning to me. I think with the kales and the silvers and the blue cabbages, it's so different for fall, and I was just drawn to this. And those blue plants, they're not mums, they're actually asters. It's a type of aster that people plant in the fall that they use as an annual. And I just think this striking blue, cool color combination it just works here. Complementary colors. What those colors are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So on the right, I have just a very basic color wheel, and you can see, blue and orange are opposite, violet and yellow, green and red. And what does that mean? That means that they work well together, and they add a lot of contrast, and it's a very bold color combination. For example, green and red. Okay, that makes me think of Christmas. That makes me think of a holly plant, the dark green shiny leaves with the red berries. Those red berries really stand out. So that's just kind of how that works. Violet and yellow work well together, blue and orange. So I will give you some examples of some complementary color themes you can do for your containers. Here's one. I found this photo online as well, and I think this container is just done so well. That middle violet or blue plant, I guess it's more blue, looks so good with the orange. I think it's just very bold, but it's also effortless. And it's funny because the person who designed this container, I doubt they went to the store and whipped out a color wheel and said, okay, well, this is blue, better pick something orange. I think it just kind of fell in naturally the way they planted it. And it just proves how well the color wheel with the complementary colors can work. And it just turned out very nice, and I like it. Oh, fun accent plants. So fun accents can be intermixed with your containers. So like pumpkins can be not planted, placed around the base of your container or even put within your container. And this kind of element can really help complete your design and enhance the autumn mood of your container and your surroundings. Adding just an obelisk or even a trellis with a grapevine could be another great element. And I did want to touch a little bit on that with the thriller. So instead of even planting a thriller, you could put an obelisk in the center, or you can put some kind of trellis in the center, and it'd be less planting, and then you could just fill in around it. It would add interest. There's a lot of cool things people have done, even using twigs. People use willow twigs or other kinds of twigs in there. This one looks like it has some kind of dogwood in it. But there's tons of stuff you can add to add a more fall aesthetic to your container without just only using plants. I'll give you a quick few watering tips. Containers and plants and containers need tons of water, especially if they're in sun. Expect to water them daily, and especially if they have a mum in there. Mums love a lot of water. They can wilt pretty bad and get kind of crispy if they're underwatered. So I'd highly recommend checking your pot every day if you have mums. However, if it's in filtered sunlight or in partial shade, you can get away with not watering as much in the fall. And especially in general in the fall, the temperatures are cooler, there's shorter days, so really you don't need to be drowning your pots every day like you do in the summer. However, just keep an eye on them, check them, because you don't want to spend a ton of energy and time to plant these pots and money and just to have them wither away from not watering. Here's the last photo I have of this presentation, and it kind of just lets me know it's over. So thank you so much for taking this course. I hope you got some good tips from me, and I hope you can use some of these at home. But lastly, I can talk about these containers. These were also in the children's garden, and they definitely don't have the thriller filler effect, but there's some design going on here. And I think they just turned out really nice. The yellow is just very eye-catching. But look at that color contrast of the yellow and the purple. It just proves right then and there another example of how bold and interesting contrasting colors can be. And this is another thing where, myself and Gigi, or the person I was working with in this garden, we didn't whip out a color wheel and just say, okay, purple and yellow. We kind of just picked some plants and it just worked really well. So do whatever you think looks best in your garden and whatever aesthetic you're trying to go for, whether it's cool color themes, monochromatic, or even just a monoculture container of one type of plant. Just go for it and have fun. Thank you, everybody.